What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today I am joined by Zst0rme, the creator of the Iden Mind Tricks build, and we're going to discuss some Iden stuff. So, Zst0rme, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. How about yourself, man?
Going good, going good. So,
Right
yeah,
on.
so you are the creator of the Iden Mind Tricks build. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny too. It's more of a collaboration with me and a local here, Rex, in
Okay.
the St. Louis, Missouri area. I came up with kind of the focal point of top end, beat stick plus control through the early game as like the core idea. And then he was kind of my testing partner and fleshing that idea out and kind of bringing it to locals, seeing what works, what doesn't. But yeah, a lot of the core concepts and major iterations over time came from me. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, so I'm just displaying the build you linked me, which is the more recent version. I think I had a video
Okay.
earlier where I showed an early version of the deck. So here we have the deck image. And one
Yep.
of the first things that jumps out to me when I'm looking at this deck is that your unit count is very low. And actually, I think this one is lower than the one that I showed previously. It looks like you've removed Gideon Hask from the build. And
Yeah.
yeah, so what's your thinking with that?
So Gideon Hask was interesting because that was actually a huge addition to the early builds. And really what he kind of did was counter Sabine single-handedly. He came
Mm,
out as a 5/5 that was big enough to, get through multiple trades. Even more powerful if you have Iden out. That's the classic combo is like you're getting those double death triggers where you get the experience, you get the heal. That's the dream combo with it. But the most difficult part of adjusting the list to at least what my current locals seem like, and I go to 5 different LGSs. I kind of cycle through them. I can't go, I can't hit 5 stores every single week. There's even more that are running events daily around the area within like 30 minutes of me. Um, but we're seeing a lot more aggression with Leia. It's a lot faster. It's a lot harder to justify dropping a Gideon that can be dealt with in a turn or two. By Leia, if you're looking down 3 units from Leia, the last thing you're gonna want to do is deal with another 1-for-1 or pray that Gideon lasts 2 turns or longer, when realistically he's not going to. So leaning more into that removal, getting the bombing runs back into the main board, seeing a lot more Bobas recently, which is kind of why making opening made it back to the main board. Um, and there's just a lot of tech choices that we could dig into further, for sure, but the ultimate thing is, this list isn't going to work for everyone, regardless of where you live. You do need to tweak some things, and whether that's ratios or even just moving things in and out of the sideboard, still running the same list. Um, you got to be more reactive to kind of what you're seeing out in the wild, for sure.
gotcha. So I would say this deck plays very differently from some of the other builds. I had an earlier red Iden that I think is much more conventional compared to this. What can you run us real quick through the overall game plan of this deck?
Yeah, so it's funny because there's so much good removal opening in hand. You can start with an opener on Inferno, setting up your next, removal going into your 3-drop removal. You can also open with Entrenched on space units or Force Choke on ground units. So basically, your early to mid game is going to be 1-for-1 as efficiently as possible. The Stormtroopers are in there because they trade with most of those early game units as well. They're just fodder to throw right into their units, or, you know, if for whatever reason they attack into your stormtrooper to clear it, even better because they're just saving you action economy that way. Um, You're just going to tempo play it out. The Death Trooper can be the same kind of deal. Death Trooper has the plus side benefit where he can kind of enable some of those higher removal kills because of Tarkin Town. So you can get that guaranteed ping damage. It might not kill, but you could use Death Trooper to trade into something else, and then you could use Tarkin Town to kill the thing that was too big for Death Trooper. Um, And then as you get to that like mid to late game, you start getting up to 6+ resources. You have a couple different avenues. And actually the main win condition is not mill.
Yeah, yeah.
Mill is definitely a viable option, and I've seen some Iden decks completely build around that. Um, but basically, the end game is going to be how can you favorably 2-for-1 or more. So the early to mid game is 1-for-1 removal, force choking a single unit, entrenching a single unit, open fire a single unit. And then you're going to start getting into your bombing runs that can multi-clear. You're going to get into your super laser that can reset the board, your Palpatine that can multi-clear, and then your Avenger that basically is the win con. Usually once you drop Avenger, it's game. Unless it's like a mirror and you're going back and forth with your Avengers or whatever. But that's kind of the general main game plan of the deck, with the alternate win con being if you are playing some sort of control, whether it's control mirror Iden, or you're playing into like a Palpatine or other slower, more tempo based deck, you can go for that vigilance mill. Usually you're not restocking them. That's more for like the actual Iden mirror. Um, and there's kind of different choke points you can get into where you guarantee that you mill them or like lock them out of using their own restocks. But um, yeah, that's like a general summary of the main and alternate win con there.
Cool. So what would you say the like strengths and weaknesses of this type of deck would be?
So strengths is definitely leaning heavier into the tempo mid-range control decks out the gate. I specifically built this deck where like if I'm playing against any sort of mid-range tempo or control deck, I want to win game one. Um, and the biggest reason why you do that is because you're so good at that 1-for-1 removal throughout the entire game. Um, and a lot of those tempo-based decks, they play it more like Magic the Gathering, where you're playing on curve, you're playing a 2-drop, you're playing a 3-drop, you're playing a 4-drop. Maybe you ramp in there with like super laser tech or resupply, but you're still like playing one thing for maximum value, sometimes two things. And that's where this deck really excels at winning, just because if I can clear everything you're putting down, we're going to get to the late game where my top end is usually superior to whatever top end is in their deck. It the instant clear if they drop something like any of the big AT-ATs in green or blue, just instantly killing it with Avenger. If they play any of the other destroyers in green, instantly killing it with Avenger. Like it's just such a it's just such a tempo swing. Once you get to that top end, I can remove so much more. And if you play multiple units, I can drop Palpatine, multi-clear, or I can full reset, get the super laser blast, gain a bunch of life if I saved Iden until then. It just has a lot of flexibility to handle slower decks. That said, the weakness definitely comes from the aggro decks, and it can feel, I've played aggro matches where I drew the perfect early game removal, and it felt like, I was playing any other mid-range tempo control match where I'm totally in control. Everything you're playing is getting blown up. You haven't done anything all game, and then we make it to the end game and I stomp. Palpatine Avenger come out, close the game. But At the same time, you have to have the correct answers for the early game against aggro, especially if it's like super aggressive Leia builds, even some of the like Han Solo builds that can, really go extra with the U-wing reinforcement, just pumping a bunch of units out all at once. If they're doing that earlier than, when you have access to your top end removal, you're still stuck in that 1-for-1 removal game, so you're going to eat a lot of damage. And you know, granted, there is a ton of healing in the deck. It definitely becomes a tighter puzzle to figure out how you're going to navigate that for sure.
Yeah, but you want to be, your ideal is that you're playing against like Luke or something, and it's 5 resources, and they play Kanan and shield it, and you play takedown or vanquish and just kill it in one hit. It's not like, oh, I'm playing against Leia and it's 5 resources, and they play like a 2-cost space unit and a 2-cost ground unit and then a 1-cost ground unit, and they're swarming the board.
Yep. Yep.
And
And I mean, there are going to be the mid game moments where, like, if it's not shielded, I can drop the interceptor, and then I, was able to blow up maybe one of the space units and then swing into the other one. There is that kind of middle ground where you can mitigate it. It's more of if they get it really early and you don't have the correct removal,
yeah,
that can cascade, like it will snowball throughout the entire game. And I've had plenty of games where that has happened and I have won or lost by whether or not I got my super laser um to
to try and
reset the
just
board.
reset
And
things. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. Yep.
And so the bombing run
Um
is kind of an additional way to get, it's like a softer reset, but it's one that you can get out much earlier, and that's still going to sweep a bunch
correct.
of those smaller units off the board.
Exactly. Yep. And that was kind of the main thing. So the deck is 52 cards. It was out of all the decks that I've played in the game, I don't notice much of a difference running 51 or 52. I have tried running more. I did notice a difference running 55. It was pretty bad, not getting the removal you need when you need it. It was, I will say, running, like, if there's ever a meta where it's super heavy control, I will go back to 55 because I had such an edge against all of the control matches that I played into having 55 cards with the extra removal, the extra draw and search engine built into there, because I could run everything. Um, and just outlasting their vigilance easier was, um, you could definitely tell a difference playing that, but it's just not good for covering all your bases, especially right now where the meta is fairly wide open in my opinion still. I mean, there's plenty of people still trying new things out. People are, I played last week, I played into a Palpatine and Tarkin and Iden, all matches, or at least builds I had never seen before. Um, so I think people are still, in that phase of trying new stuff out, even if it's not like fully optimal. But again, like if you're playing well enough, um, I think the set one balance is pretty forgiving on that side of things. Um, but guess I derailed there for a second. The restock is important for the Iden mirror
Yeah.
specifically because you get into that vigilance lockout, which you touched on in your other video. We don't need to really harp on it, but it is kind of interesting, like finding that ratio. I originally had 3 restocks where I had 2 in the main, 1 in the side. I found 2 was more than enough with the additional resource of I actually favored mission briefing and search your feelings more than I did the 3rd restock because
Hmm.
the goal is to see the 3 vigilance first and then restock. If you get through all 3 of them before your opponent, you're usually in a much better position going into that end game to try and lock them out where, they are decked out but they have restock in hand, but you have enough resources to play vigilance if they do it, is kind
Gotcha.
of how you guarantee that win.
Yeah, one
Um,
nuance that someone pointed out in the comments of my last video is that restock can actually target itself, which I didn't realize worked with
yep.
the timing structure and makes the card more potent. Actually, let's do a quick card highlight there for restock. It's funny because I think I remember telling somebody at a local draft that there were people that were playing this deck, playing this card competitively, and the person legitimately thought that I misspoke and said and meant resupply, because he had just
That's
assumed
funny.
it was such garbage.
Yep.
But it has an important role. So,
Yep.
choose up to 4 cards in discard pile, put them on the bottom of their owner's deck in a random order. So I think this was actually intended primarily to be a counter to recursion tactics, but
Sure.
it it seems to have its main use here not to counter opponent's recursion, but to use on yourself to counter mill. And
Right.
the interesting thing with this that someone pointed out from the previous video is that the way that the timing works, this goes to the discard pile when you play it before you have chosen your targets, apparently. So you can choose restock as one of the targets for restock and put it back on the bottom of the deck to give you kind of a sustainable end game against this mill stuff.
Yeah. No, that was that comment was huge for us too. I remember reading that and sharing it with some of my testing buddies. Like, we have not been playing it this way. That's crazy. It's
I know. Wait,
makes
you guys didn't know about it either?
no, I had no idea.
Oh
I mean,
man, that's wild.
I
Okay.
I played it in such a way where I never needed to, but I mean,
Hey,
it
yeah, I mean it's
definitely reinforces the choice for only needing two of them in the deck.
yeah, I mean it's makes it even kind of even more of a nice counter card than people would realize. That's cool.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the dream combo really is like you're going through a vigilance or two, you immediately restock them, and then you search your feelings to get the vigilance again, and you just keep hammering them out. It's a tough match though, because again, like you still gotta respect the removal. Like you're both dropping, the units that you are dropping tend to need to be dealt with immediately. So the end game is kind of wonky in that mirror. But for my sideboard and kind of touching a little bit more on that, I specifically have Vanquish as two of in the main now, because I was starting to see more aggro, and Vanquish just again as that kind of mid to late game 1-for-1 wasn't doing it against Boba and Leia, where they're dropping more units in that mid
Yeah.
game where I need something like a bombing run or open fire,
Vanquish is a
whatever
great
else.
card when it's taken out somebody's, Luke Skywalker, Jedi Knight, or Han Solo,
Yep.
or Avenger, Redemption Medical, one of those real big units. But
Right.
if you're spending 5 to kill a unit that costs 2 or 3 that the opponent's playing multiple of, it's not a great deal.
Yeah, so just kind
It
of shifting things around there. Sorry, go ahead.
it it's kind of funny too, because like removal is extremely bad in this game compared to some other games, just in terms of like the price points and so on. But it can still be quite effective with the like right ones in the right places.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the biggest thing was finding the ratios for the correct removal when, again, like looking at something like Stormtrooper and Death Trooper, I look at them as removal, not
Yep.
units, because I'm not using them to hit the base. I'm using them to clear or trade. Maybe if it's an open field, like sure, I'm
Yeah,
gonna hit
they
your
can
base
swing
for
for
three
three,
if it's
whatever. It's not
free, but
terrible.
yeah, exactly. Um, but that's not their primary objective. So just
Yeah,
kind
the
of looking at the
primary
deck
thing
and
is
like,
like, oh, my stormtrooper traded with their battlefield marine or whatever.
exactly. Yeah, and I'd say the last piece for the sideboard that's worth touching on is some of the tech that we had been playtesting around with is whether or not to go with force throw or force surrender. I personally like force throw because I think it serves twofold. I think early game it can be good against aggro matches where you want them to get into top deck mode, because that basically puts them in 1-for-1 removal mode, which usually guarantees you the win as long as you're not just totally whiffing on all of your removal cards. Um, and then Force Surrender was the other one in consideration. And for me, I think Force Surrender is also really good. I think it's more impactful in the control matchups, but needing to get that base damage in to make it live, um,
But yeah,
is
the
what makes
timing's a
it
little weird.
trickier for, yeah. Because that means you have to have a unit that sticks, hit their base, and then do it. Um, which I mean, if you look at my unit count, like it's just not happening with this kind of list. Um, and
Forced
if it is,
surrender.
like that means Avengers stuck around, and I didn't really need Force Surrender anyway.
Forced surrender would be an extremely strong card if it did not require you to have already damaged the enemy base, or if it was like a reaction to damaging the enemy base or something. It would be
Yep,
much better than its current timing. And actually, let's get
for
a.
sure.
I'm going to bring up a highlight on forced surrender so they can see what we're talking about. 'Cause that's not in the list, but it's a. It is an interesting card. So I know some people have also
Yeah,
been
and I'll
running
say
this as a
for
counter
yeah,
for.
I was just about to say some of the people that I've tested with, or shared my list with, and talked to about building out aggression Iden are running for surrender in their sideboard for really the kind of mirror counter
Yeah.
to heavily punish that end game.
Yeah, so force surrender, 6 cost event, draw 2 cards. Each opponent whose base you've damaged this phase discards 2 cards from their hand. So there is a kind of comedic option in like Twin Suns or whatever, where you use Sabine's ability and then make everybody else discard a bunch of cards. But in a 1v1 scenario, I think it can still be quite relevant, but the fact that you have to have damaged their base this phase is a major downside for the card.
Yeah, for sure. And just on the flip side, I mean, force throw is so much cheaper that it's easier to just, again, it's in my mind, it's exactly what the deck wants to do early game, 1-for-1 removal. I removed a card from hand, and I spent one to do it. Doesn't really get much more efficient than that. And then you have that flip side option where if for whatever reason, maybe I just didn't see any of them early game. If I have one with Dooku or Palpatine, I get to double up on that board clear, usually discarding a
Yeah, in
card.
the
And
in the ideal
if we're in the
situation,
end
you get
game, yeah,
yeah, you can get a 2-for-1, and for just one resource, that's pretty good.
yeah. Yeah, and the
Uh,
hope is, ideally later in the game like that, they're probably going to have somewhere between more of their like 3+ drop cards in hand, so they're discarding something like that. It should be
yeah,
taking something out, or at least doing
it
good damage.
yeah, if you're playing it in the late game, you're less likely to hit the like nightmare scenario of like you play it and they discard Metal Ceremony and take no damage and
Right.
then are able to hit you because more than you were expecting them to be able to. So
Exactly. Yep.
let's talk Tarkin Town. So this version is on Tarkin Town. I think that if I recall correctly, a very early version of this deck was on 30 HP. Is that right?
So I mean, I have tried both. I don't know exactly how many versions of this I've published. I'm not one to keep secrets for my decks. You know, especially right now when there's like zero stakes, major tournaments don't start till next set anyway. Um, but I've gone through a lot of testing, both bases, bunch of different cards have moved in and out of the main and sideboard. Overall, I think there's enough healing with Iden where I prefer Tarkin Town personally, just because again, it's that extra efficient board clear where, you know, looking at Stormtrooper or Death Trooper again, maybe I couldn't completely trade with the swing, but I can finish it off with the Tarkin Town, or just really large clears like taking out a Vader using open fire plus Tarkin Town. Um, it just it gives you a lot more reach in the mid game, for decks specifically that ramp, where you have that like problematic turn 4, turn 5, where they're playing something that most decks that don't ramp aren't exactly ready for, but you can remove the immediate threat. Um, and I think that's huge for the action economy because even if they, let's say they Vader, excuse me, and Vader's the only one that I remove, um, I'm going into that next turn being able to have all my resources up to 1-for-1, whatever that other cheaper unit is, and usually, maybe another unit at that point.
Yeah, I think there's also a synergy with bombing run, where bombing run only doing 3 damage is something that I think is, not the most optimal for something that's supposed to be wiping the arena or whatever. So like, but
Yeah,
if you have Tarkin Town, you can, get that extra reach. So, maybe they have, you know, 3 small fighters and one of them was buffed by a wing leader. And, in that situation, if you don't have Tarkin Town, you could bombing run that, but their most important ship stays alive. And with Tarkin Town, you can use that to clear out that ship as well.
exactly. Yeah, and I mean that's a huge part of it too, is just again finding whatever that problem threat that you couldn't trade for efficiently on. Like it just gives you that extra reach. There's so many different examples you could come up with, whether it's the bombing run or Vader example. Um, just having that available, it's good in every matchup.
Cool.
I think the 5 health trade-off is, that's one vigilance. Heal 5, mill them for 6. You've got your 30 HP base back on top of all the Iden healing. I think it's a totally fine trade-off. I've never been in a situation, at least in recent testing, where I've wished I had the 30 health base.
Yeah, I'm a big target. I think at least for ECL and Tarkin Town, I think it's difficult to justify the 30 HP base compared to those because their abilities are so strong. If you start talking about
For
like
sure.
Jeddah City, Security Complex, I think I think the epic actions on those bases are a bit weaker, and I think there's more of an argument for
Yep.
running 30 HP in those colors. But I'm a big Tarkin Town fan.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, it's not the deck we're talking about, but I think they just become more niche. Like a heavy shield Luke deck, I'm sure would love to run Security Complex over the 30 HP base, but he's getting the extra shield buffs as it is.
Yeah, it's interesting, and even then, if you're running like double blue Luke or whatever, Security Complex, it can be really good. And also
Mm,
sometimes you use it and they like waylay your guy or whatever, and you're like, well, rip.
right.
I spent 5 HP for this. It has like a
Yeah.
much higher ability to just derp and not do anything compared to the other bases.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Yeah, I mean it'll be interesting to see how, if any sort of upgrade protection kind of makes its way into the game with whether it's set to or anything in the future.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think it necessarily needs it right now or anything like that, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's definitely things you see in other games. Like Magic the Gathering has the whole sword series with protection from different colors, and um, I think they've definitely leaned themselves into like decks like Chirrut who want to get that Voltron heavy build with one big dude with a bunch of upgrades on him, or Chewbacca does pretty well with that too.
Yeah,
Um,
if there were an upgrade that said like this unit can't be exhausted or this unit can't be targeted by opposing events or
yeah,
something, sure, it would be all over that.
right.
Okay, so there are some people who have claimed this is actually a prison deck. What do you think about that?
Ah, a prison deck or prism?
No, prison the deck archetype, not
Yeah,
not Prism from Flesh and Blood.
yeah, yeah. I mean, hard control. It's funny because there's definitely an attitude someone can have when playing or playing against this deck that is very negative. I've always liked control. I've always played control. I've always played mid range or some sort of like deck that has, that puzzle you're figuring out of how can I counter or stop whatever they're doing, whatever way the game allows. Um, and it's one thing for a new player to play against this deck with their 10 card changed Vader straight out of the starter deck box and get totally mopped because everything they play gets removed, winning without even needing to use Iden's heals. That's not a feel good situation. um but I think there is something that, at least my local community does a good job of, and I've seen in plenty of other games, both on the negative and positive side. I grew up in Ohio, which had a huge thriving TCG community, and I had some really positive experiences learning how to play Yu-Gi-Oh, which is, in my opinion, still the hardest TCG to play like at a top tier competitive level, just because of how much card and archetype knowledge you need. With like, you need to know everyone's combos, you need to know exactly when you can counter, when you need to counter. Is it targeting, non-targeting, all of this stuff that's running through your head. Um, so with that said, I mean, yes, it is a heavy control deck, which,
Yeah.
if you want to put a negative spin on it, would be a prison deck. But it's not locking your opponent out of play in the game, which I think is what a true prison deck is. And
Yeah.
there are examples of that for like Yu-Gi-Oh, where you're playing floodgates, which are basically cards that say your opponent can't actually play anything that this floodgate prevents. Um, you know, this is a
Yeah.
reactive deck. So
Yeah.
every time you
Magic
play
had like,
something,
sorry, go ahead.
no, 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 go ahead.
Yeah, so like in Magic the Gathering, there was stuff like, what was it? It was like Kismet Stasis combo where like people don't untap and your opponent's stuff comes into play tapped and like the opponent could like
Yep.
literally just not do anything. And
Hmm.
it was a little more complicated than that because like you had to do certain things to allow yourself to make plays with that deck, but but like the main plan was to make it so the opponent couldn't untap any of their cards and just go until they mill out. And it's like
Yep.
so that's what I would call a prison deck. Playing a lot of one for one removal is not a prison deck. It is a hard control
No,
deck, but it's not a prison deck.
right. 100%. It is very reactive. It every time you play something, it puts it on me or whoever's piloting the deck to have an answer for it. And, I've built the deck to try and be as efficient as possible, but the realistic thing is that I'm not going to have the answer every time. But there are going to
Yeah.
be games where I do, and that can be very defeating as a new player to play against something like this, which is why specifically for me, like when I play um against newer players, it depends on the setting. If we are playing Swiss and I recognize you as a completely new player, like we're still going to play the match out, but my demeanor is not like I'm, going through the motions, not talking, just blowing everything up. I'm not sarcastic or demeaning about it. Like, it's funny that you bring this question up because I played against, there's this dad that comes with his daughter every week, to one of the locals that I play at. Great guy. Hasn't played TCGs in forever, but is playing it again because his daughter's playing it, and he really loves Star Wars, and they share that connection together. Um, and he's not a bad player, but he's definitely not like your average competitive grinder either. So there's a lot of things that, have flown by his head because he hasn't been playing 8 hours a day on, grinding online and testing with friends and reading on forums and watching YouTube videos, all of that.
Yeah, and
But
there's a range of skills in this game that's pretty wide. The game is new, and even at a tournament, you get people where it's like, "Oh, this is my first game." My friend said this was cool, and I like Star Wars. And then you also get people where
right.
it's like, "Oh, yeah, this person's played several other card games on a very competitive level, and maybe they just spent 6 hours prior to this playing webcam matches with their friends to like really
Yep.
hone in on their deck." And there are big differences.
Yeah, it's a huge difference, but I specifically bring that one up just because it was so funny to me playing the game against him because we were just cracking up the whole time. He was playing a very like control tempo Palpatine deck, um, which I have played against a lot, so I now know like I don't play units into that list until I'm like ready to just literally remove everything they play. And we were just laughing because he'd play something, I blew it up. He'd play something, I blew it up, and we were just cracking up the whole time. Um, and I talked to him afterwards and like pretty in depth of like, action economy wise, you don't want to be playing another unit before you swing with the unit you already had on board because you know I'm going to remove it immediately.
Yep.
Just little things like that. But like, what could have been a very negative experience of just sitting there getting everything you played removed off the board, clean 2-0, move on with your life. We laughed about it and I got to talk to him a good amount about, some changes he can make to his deck and better
Yeah.
plays he can make. So I think just like regardless of whether you play a control deck or not, having a positive attitude while you're playing goes a long way. There is kind of like a mindset some people get into when they're playing for anything on the line where they're just very serious and in the zone. And if you have to do that, it is what it is. But um, I have always prided myself, regardless of how high the prize is and how far I've gone with like professional level play for Flesh and Blood and Magic the Gathering. I have always been kind to the people I'm playing with and just enjoying the game.
Yeah. I think yeah, my personal attitude is similarly that I think you want both people to be having a fun time, even in an intense competition. Like honestly, I don't know if you would go this far, and it might sound crazy to some people, but I have given people take backs at world championships before. I don't want to be the guy who is like super strict rules enforcement all the time, like no sense of
Mhm.
humor, getting annoyed if someone is taking like more than 10 seconds to think of a play. I've had some games where there's someone who has a like very intense, very competitive attitude, like calling the judge to try to get the other person to speed up if they're being even like a little slow and stuff. And I don't know, that's not fun to me. That's not really the way I want to play the game. I think you gotta, even in a very competitive tournament, I think you can still have a friendly attitude and not one that is oppressive or whatever.
For sure. I think there's limits to it too, right? Like I would say for me personally, if I was playing at a world's level, it would have to depend on what the take back is. Like, because you can tell the difference between someone who's gone through 12 hours and like had a brain fart versus someone who's intentionally trying to do something.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I think that would sway my opinion too, but in general, a lot of it's just protecting yourself. If you're playing at that high of a level, there are general expectations that you're not taking anything back, you aren't slow playing, and I've judged enough too to see a lot of those differences, and it's tough. Like out of I've judged nationals, worlds for multiple games, TCGs, and miniature war games, and out of more than 7 different TCGs, I've only ever had to DQ someone once for slow play, and it required like 3 full rounds of me investigating just to like actually confirm that was happening.
Yeah,
Which is
unfortunately it can be
unfortunate
very
because
subjective.
it affected those 3 people plus the people he'd played beforehand that had reported it initially. um but yeah, it's really tough to um identify some of those situations. And I think too, especially in like a casual setting like your locals, there's going to be a lot of people who aren't like, even if they know better and they've heard people tell them like, decision making should happen in like less than 2 minutes, and um how do I generally identify slow play, things like that. They're not going to feel comfortable doing it because you know they're creating conflict with strangers effectively. I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully you become friends with some people at your LGS and all of that, but ultimately you are going to be playing with a lot of strangers. So yeah, it can be tricky to navigate, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I've encountered people before that have said, "Oh, well, calling a judge shouldn't be like a big deal. It should be like a thing that is fine to do, and so on." And I think that on a
Mhm.
certain level, I understand that, but like the social reality of calling a judge is not that. Like in most events, like
Yeah.
there is a risk of social conflict or of altercations or similar in that scenario, and
Yep.
And I think as a result of that, honestly, a lot of people probably do judge calls less than they should because they don't want to be a dick or whatever. But it can be unfortunate because there are some situations where you should actually get a judge involved. And this game, we'll see what it looks like once this game has its own judge program. I believe FFG has said that's going to
Right.
start happening with set two. So, we'll probably have some more detailed guidelines and stuff at that time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense since that's, when they're setting up to have the larger tournaments start kicking off as it is. But I think one of the perks to Star Wars, at least from a judging standpoint, is how much easier it is to understand the game state. With that action economy of passing back and forth after one singular action, in most instances at least. It's very easy to come up and ask someone like, what's the last three things that happened? Whereas,
Right.
you go to like a Magic the Gathering tournament and it's a whole different ball game trying to just
Yeah.
immediately understand the board state.
Yeah, and you get like what was the exact phrasing that he used when asking like if you were going to
Yep.
do anything and stuff to try to figure out if someone was trying to rule shark the opponent into passing priority improperly or whatever. And
Right.
this game doesn't have any of that, and I'm happy about it. Even the prospect for gamesmanship aside, I think those complex timing structures are really annoying to have to figure out sometimes. I remember playing
Yeah.
Dorinthia in Flesh and Blood, and the
Hmm.
reprise mechanic had annoying nuance to it with respect to how people played reactions and stuff into it. And the dumbest part, like, so I knew how this worked. The dumbest part was I felt like I was almost compelled to ask people these questions even when they didn't understand the nuance to it. Like, I would be playing this and I was like, okay, do you do anything before this resolves? And it's
Right.
like, you know, they shouldn't. And like, ugh, I'm
Yep.
happy not to have to deal with that. I'm not gonna explain all the intricacies of the reprise mechanic, but it was frustrating at times.
No,
And
that's funny. I
there
mean,
was there were those small percentage of games against Kano or whatever where them doing stuff before the thing
yep.
resolves is actually super important. So it's not like it was in the rules for no reason, but the
Right.
the rules that were there for a small percentage of games, I think at least for me, it had an annoying presence in games where they weren't that relevant because they created that timing structure that you had to interact with.
Yeah, having a timing structure that isn't universally used widely, um, across all decks, at least consistently, can be frustrating because you still want to ask to make sure you're not skipping over it, so you're not
Right.
losing the potential benefit, but you're basically just bugging people who most of the time ignore that whole window.
Yeah, it
I
was.
think one of the sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say in Fab for a while, like Kano was basically the only deck that used instant. Like people would play like Sigil of Solace or whatever in Blitz, but Kano was
Yep.
almost the only deck that used any instance. So it was almost like the game's like complicated timing structure existed like more or less for one deck, and it wasn't completely true, but it was like. eh. I'm wondering what the percentage of times that someone played an instant in Kano versus non-Kano games was, or like things at
Right.
instant speed, and I wouldn't be surprised if like 95% or more of the time that someone played something at instant speed it was Kano.
I mean, I would agree with that. In my experience, Flesh and Blood, um, it's it's a whole other animal to discuss Blitz, in my opinion. I've never been a, a fan of that format, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think for me, one of the interesting rulings, I'd be interested to see how lenient they are on is something like regional governance, because
Oh yeah.
naming cards can create a bunch of tricky situations, especially when you have a game that has the unique name rule it does, where you can have multiple Han Solos with different subtext. Um,
Interestingly, I think they ruled that if you say regional governor and say Han Solo, it applies to all cards named Han Solo regardless of subtitle, which is
did
interesting.
they really? Okay.
Yeah, so in the future, if there's like three different Han units in your build, regional governor can
Yeah,
suddenly lock
that's
down
a
like a
lot more
larger percentage of
powerful.
your deck. Yeah, but no, you
Jeez.
get those
Okay.
situations where someone misremembers the name of the card. Like, maybe like if
Right.
someone's, if someone says like I don't know, like First Legion Shore Trooper. It's ambiguous what card they meant because it's First Legion Snow Trooper or Seasoned Shore Trooper, and it's like they really have to specify. And ideally, the opponent clarifies that. Similarly,
Right.
if someone says Snow Trooper, you have to get them to clarify that because did they mean First Legion Snow Trooper? Do they mean Snow Trooper Lieutenant? I
Or does
haven't
that
seen.
just become an invalid target and they
Yeah,
just
exactly.
wasted the ability? Like,
The true
yeah.
the true rule shark answer is actually you named the card Snow Trooper, which doesn't exist, so your ability doesn't do anything
No.
to either of these cards. But you know, I
I
haven't
forget what
seen
the
that yet,
example
but
was.
yeah.
There was a I think it was modern for Magic the Gathering. There was like a high level tournament finals where someone lost because they had a card that they could name a card and the guy had two of them in the like two different kinds in the deck and he named the wrong one. And like it would make no sense for him to name the one that he pulled out, but
But he said what he
because
said,
of yeah, exactly.
and they were being strict. Yeah, it's yeah, Magic has had some odd moments. There was infamously once I forget what level of event it was, but it was a high level event, and someone was DQ'd out of the finals and had their prizes revoked because they were playing the card before they tapped their lands or something, which at that time was not allowed. And this was considered so
Mm.
unjust that the players rushed the stage and demanded that he be reinstated and stuff. And I think
Jeez.
in the no, it was crazy. Like I wasn't there. I heard about this secondhand, but
Sure.
purportedly people like actually took the mic away from the guy that was hosting the event or whatever. And
That's crazy.
no, I mean, someone came up there and gave some kind of speech and calmed them down and stuff. But I think they did actually partially cave. I think the guy was given a match loss or something, so he was still essentially lost the
Oh,
finals due to
sure.
this weird ruling. But I think they gave him the
Right.
second place prizes instead of like a full DQ. So it was. Sometimes there's some weird stuff in the world of these high level competitions. Actually, while we're talking
For
about this
sure.
stuff, what do you think about the chess clock controversy? What is your opinion on chess clocks in competitive play?
So it
And I should
doesn't
say,
need to be
sorry,
in competitive play, but yeah, go ahead.
for most games you can't actually do chess clocks unless you have a digital client. It just doesn't make any sense because the timing structure is too complicated. But with Star Wars Unlimited, it would be possible to play with chess clocks in competitive play if you wanted to. And if
Yeah.
players thought that was a good idea, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that and whether you think it might be in the cards for the future.
So I don't think it's necessary at all. I think it would be interesting to have side events with a chess clock, like a, blitz type variant that is specifically meant for very quick gameplay. Because if you really get the actions down, like granted, I play a control deck. When I'm playing against seasoned players, we get through all three games, even if it's a control mirror.
Yeah.
Because what am I gonna do? I either remove the card you played or I pass. Like it's not a very difficult set of actions to get through. Um,
But then
I
sometimes you go up
do
against the
think,
person who doesn't know, not familiar with the
yeah,
mirror, or
yeah,
they know
yeah,
about it in
right,
theory, and they take a huge amount of time, even though you don't.
right. So what I think is chess clocks are a great training tool. I do not think it would ever actually make it into competitive play, like for sanctioned events for Star Wars. But I think it is a great awareness tool to practice, with your friends, have the chess clock, set whatever time you're shooting for in a like single game, and practice those kind of reps because it gives you a lot of value information at the end of the game to look back and see how much time you had left versus how much time they had left and
Yeah.
like discussing why that happened and like potentially even like having a third person there to kind of take notes throughout the game like for extended periods of time that happen on a particular turn. um because realistically, I don't think it'll happen in major events, but I think it is a huge leg up as a competitive player to know how to identify slow play. And slow play usually isn't intentional.
Yeah.
Like if you're lost in thought, you're lost in thought. You're not thinking about time. You're not, you don't realize how many minutes you've taken. But knowing when to prod and be like, hey, it's been, a minute. We'll need to pick up the pace to, keep this match going within time. And like if that's met with a negative response, let it slide for a second, try again. If that's met with a negative response, call a judge. Like having the patience to identify when you need the extra help goes a long way. Because realistically, the judge is going to take up more time, and like whether or not they give you time back is up to them and like the tournament structure and however they set up judge rules and things like that. You might not get all the time back. Um, that you could have had if you just resolved it amongst yourselves. So
Right.
I think it's a great tool. I don't think it'll be in high level competitive play, but I do think people should be aware of how long they're taking and how long their opponent's taking, and practice being conscious of that. Even at locals, practice being nice about approaching them and asking them to make a play. Um, because that's just going to help you feel less stressed about it if you decide to go to larger tournaments.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. So, like, even if they do not adopt it as a competitive thing, which I think, like you, I think it's unlikely probably that they would actually have it as a formal part of the system, but it could be useful as a training tool. I also liked your earlier idea of having it as like kind of this game's blitz format, like speed swoo or whatever. It's like, all right, guys, you each have 5 minutes on the chess clock. Let's go. I think that could
Yeah,
actually be pretty fun.
yeah, I think it'd be interesting. You could see some interesting aggro plays, or even just someone who's really good with that control puzzle of like maintaining that one for one. Be
Yeah, I do.
interesting to see.
I do think Sabine would be a popular deck in that format.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so that I think that's about bringing us to the end here. Are there any final thoughts you might have on the on the Iden Mind Tricks build or on Star Wars Unlimited more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, one thing that comes up a lot that gets a little bit of negativity is whether people should net deck or not. I think it's totally fine if you want to take this list one for one, take it to your locals, run it up against, everyone that you're playing against weekly, and try it for yourself. I think the biggest takeaway from that and what is going to help you be a better player from, that first step of net decking something, whether it's this list or another list you're more interested in, is, you know, review those matches after you go home, whether you win or lose, and kind of think back on like, what kind of better plays could I make? What are maybe some cards that I could tech into the main or sideboard that would help shore up some of those matches? Get yourself critically thinking about how can I be a better player, and then how can I make this deck serve me better, in my environment? Because this list, regardless of what anyone else tells you, is not going to just win you every game, anywhere, any state. Um, anyone that says that is lying. There's a lot of information that goes into deciding main board sideboard choices, and if you're ever going to go to like a regional or worlds or anything like that, you'll see people making changes the day of, the night before, um based on whatever information starts cropping up or new ideas that pop into their head. Um and, and I think Star Wars as a whole is just in a really good spot where there's still a lot of room for deck exploration. I was on Iden aggression since week 2, so I've gone through a lot of iterations of this list. This is about as refined as I can make it for my particular locals. But whether it's the same 50 and you swap out some cards from the main to side, or completely new cards that you'd rather play in it, um, making those choices for yourself helps you be a better deck builder and player overall. And I think people, if you have the means to do so, not everyone can build every single deck or whatever, but the more decks you play, the better you will be as more sets come out because you'll remember more of the card pool from back then that you can then bring into these newer archetypes and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think there's also, just a very classic piece of advice that I've seen in actually a lot of games is if you find yourself really frustrated by some strategy, one thing you can do is try playing as the strategy that's frustrating you and seeing like what are the moments where this goes wrong. And it gives you you can get
For
a
sure.
better understanding of like the weak points and like things that you can exploit when you're on the other side of it.
100%. And it's funny you mentioned that because what put me on Force Throw was a buddy of mine that plays locally. He goes by Morningstar. He built a Command Vader deck that one week just absolutely trashed me with this deck. Like he between Force Throw and Force Surrender and just like TIE fighter buffing, advanced TIE fighter buffing his Imperial units, tons of cheap Imperial units he can spam the board with, Vader coming down, spamming another unit. Um, he just always had multiple units on the board, so he owned the early game. I couldn't one for one remove him, get removal in, and he specifically saved his force throws and force surrenders for when I was low, and he hit big hits like a super laser that I was holding on to, a Palpatine that I was holding on to, totally crippled the game. Um, there are ways I can play around it now. And it's not like I just auto lose to that, but it was something that was like, in that moment for the version of the deck I had at the time was a huge wake up call because it was like, whoa, I didn't even think about, them controlling me while spamming the board with hand control. And yeah, it was a huge thing because Vader by himself, he's a pain in the butt to
Oh yeah.
remove. He's huge, and you put Vader's, lightsaber on there, or God forbid, one point you had Vader and Fallen lightsaber on there. It's a lot.
The dual wield. That's nasty.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's been great talking to you. I mean, we covered a wide gamut of topics here with the the deck list, some of the stuff on playing control more broadly, competitive play, that type of stuff. Any last thoughts?
No, I mean, it's been great talking. Thanks for hosting, and look forward to seeing what content you got in the future, man.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to you for coming on here. I thought it was a very cool interview. So thank you again for taking the time to do this.
Anytime, man.
All right, that's gonna about do it for this one, guys. Thanks to y'all for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.